Good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. Chief Joseph has already been formally introduced, so I'd just like to welcome him again. I'm also going to introduce Kimberly Murray, who's a member of the Kanesatake Mohawk Nation and is the Assistant Deputy Attorney General, Aboriginal Justice, where she is responsible for overseeing the implementation of First Nations representative on Ontario Jury's report. Previously, Kim was the Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the Executive Director of the Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto. Kim is the recipient of several awards, including the Law Foundation's Guthrie Award and the Law Society of Upper Canada's Laura Legg Award. Recently, the Indigenous Bar Association granted Kimberly the Indigenous Peoples Council designation. And we also have Max Finday, who's a citizen of Sweetgrass First Nation and is currently serving as co-executive director of Canadian Roots Exchange, a national nonprofit providing Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth with opportunities to engage in reconciliation dialogues, leadership development, and educational initiatives. He's also been recognized as one of the top 40 change makers under 40 in Saskatchewan. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree majoring in political studies from the University of Saskatchewan and has seen firsthand misunderstandings that exist in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and knows that stereotypes still cause harm today. He believes strongly that the leadership and voices of this generation of young people can achieve reconciliation for Canada. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. And as Chief Joseph suggested, my natural inclination is to shut up and listen, but I've been asked to moderate, so I'm going to do just that. I've got a number of questions that I'm going to hope will help kickstart a bit of discussion, and then I've been informed that I think at the 45-minute mark, I'll get a little red card, and then we'll open things up to questions. And I'm presuming, are there microphones in the audience, Len? Is that how that's meant to work? Okay, so there are. So this will give you a chance as well to ask further questions of our panel. So now, do I stand or should I? I'll sit. Okay. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start with the question that deals with an aspect of reconciliation. George Erasmus, the former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, talked recently about how we're all treaty people. And so I'd just like to start maybe asking the panel what they think of the idea that everyone is a treaty person, and maybe how that works in areas where there were no treaties, or maybe where the treaties were in some ways coercively enacted by the government. So perhaps we could start with that idea, if that. Young guy. Okay, Max, do you want to?
Oh man!
Start? Put you on the spot.
Chief Doctor, holy smokes! Putting me on the spot here.
Yeah.
Kinnaskumtin kakiawa nasiga sin kisgao pisa mwasa segwa wikasko tsinia kinnaskumtin manatumio kisgao. No, it's so that I just said I don't know. Next, no, I'm just kidding. I just want to acknowledge you all for being here today, and really paying close attention. I see lots of notes being taken on the table. I'm stalling. Can you tell? This is about relationships. This idea of reconciliation is about relationships. If you get a bunch of Métis people in a room, they'll say, well, we're not treaty people. We never signed treaty. That was between you Indians and the white people. That wasn't us. So I've been in some pretty intense conversations about that. You have unceded, unsurrendered territories, in places across this country where I come from. We do say we're treaty people, and that's the way we frame this relationship, this understanding of our interaction, how we know each other, how we understand each other is based on that sacred agreement that my ancestors signed or touched the pen with. We said, these newcomers, we want to share the land with you. We want to see you prosper the way that we prosper. So we take you as our relatives. We share this land with you with the understanding that we can both prosper, that there's enough for all of us. Now, that has been perverted by policies and bureaucrats, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but what we understand and what we hear from Justice Canada or from provincial bodies or governments saying, no, the treaty relationship is we got the land and you get $5 a year. Now, my ancestors were really smart people. And, even today, my dad can sell a used car for twice as much as what it's worth, right? So we wouldn't have taken that deal. We wouldn't have sold the land, to which we never believed we had ownership to anyway. That's not our philosophy. That's not our beliefs. So when we ask ourselves, are we all treaty people? Not everyone's going to say yes, but what we have to come back to is that relationship piece. We have to talk about how we're related to each other and how we interact with each other.
Sego, Kwekwe, Kimberly Murray, Haudenosaunee of Kanesatake. I first want to acknowledge the traditional territory that this beautiful building sits on. And I have to, not to take away from everybody else sitting in the room, but I really just want to hold up Chief Bobby Joseph. He's been such an inspiration to me in the time that I worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I was on that, it's not up there in there. I was on that walk. And I was never more proud in my life to be part of something so important. So I just want to say, Nawe, for all the incredible work that you do. So treaty, we're all treaty people. Just as Max said, to me, treaty is about relationships. We have a two-row wampum treaty with the Haudenosaunee people, and it talks about respect, it talks about friendship, and it talks about peace. Those are the principles that we are to work together, and we are to travel together down the river. And so, it's about roles and responsibilities. So whether you have a formal written treaty, it's really about relationship building, and it's about what are your roles, what are my roles, what are your responsibilities, and what are my responsibilities. And let's hold each other to those roles and responsibilities and work together. So I think, yes, we are all treaty people, whether we have a written treaty or not. It's about what kind of, as we heard earlier, what kind of Canadians, what kind of society do we want to have? And we want one built on respect, friendship, and trust.
Thank you. I come from British Columbia, and they have two small, older treaties and 2 or 3 modern-day treaties. And so treaties haven't been discussed to the length that they have been in other parts of the country for as long a period. But when I heard the question, it reminded me of the answer that we needed to provide to many Canadians who first heard the story about our collective past together in residential schools and colonization. And many newcomers said, well, what does that have to do with me? I had nothing to do with it directly and don't know anything about it. And my usual answer was that if you're a newcomer and you signed up to this country, you are everything Canadian, including the history of this place. So if you only came last month or yesterday, if you're a Canadian, all of it belongs to you, our history as well as our present and our dreams for the future. So it's the same is true for treaties. Many Canadians think the treaty is between government and our local tribes. Well, government represents, of course, all of us, whether we know anything about the treaties or not. We should learn about the treaties, I think, and we should encourage our leaders, our government leaders, to uphold the honor of the Crown and live up to the intention of those agreements that were meant to create the coexistence, peaceful coexistence between all of us and the sharing of lands and resources. So we should leave this room today saying, yes, we're all treaty people, and do everything in your influence to make sure that we honor past treaties, encourage new ones, and then move forward together in a new way that'll give expression to who we fully want to be collectively as Canadians.
I too was on that very moving march, and it was a wonderful experience for me as well. So thank you so much for organizing that. It was an amazing time. I just want to, there was a poll that came out with the Environics Institute in June of this year, and I've been looking at the findings very closely. It's on reconciliation of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and it polled non-Indigenous Canadians. The findings suggest that most Canadians or respondents are in favor of closing gaps, health gaps, economic gaps, educational gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The survey did not ask about things like self-determination, nation-to-nation relationships, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So my question basically relates to, are most Canadians in favor of what you might call civil rights and equality, but what about the other issues, maybe the harder aspects of reconciliation? In some ways it might have to do with things that relate to sovereignty and self-determination and the UNDRIP. I'm not sure how to ask the question exactly, but maybe just inviting some reflections on some of those issues that have to do with Indigenous peoples as governments, as civilizations, and as peoples, rather than as people, if that makes sense.
I'll take a first stab at that. I just want to go back to the two-row wampum. When we look at the two-row wampum in that treaty, it talks about, or it shows us, on the one side of the river we have the vessel, and in the vessel are the settlers. And on the other side of the river we have the canoe with the Indigenous people in Canada. And I think that when we talk about reconciliation right now, government, and I am part of government now, is now focusing on the vessel side, and the fact that Indigenous people are sort of trapped in that vessel, and we've never invested on the canoe side. We've never invested in revitalizing governance systems. We've never invested in revitalizing legal systems and laws. So I think now, when we talk about reconciliation, yes, we have to improve the living conditions on the reserves, and we have to improve education, and we have to close the gaps. Those are all important, but we can't forget about the other side of the two-row wampum. We have to invest in the canoe and support communities in revitalizing their systems and their laws and their traditions, because those are the things that we took away. Those are the things that the colonizers took away. So let's invest in those opportunities at the same time as dealing with the inequalities that currently exist.
Yeah, so I'm half Norwegian. The room erupts in a gasp. And so reconciliation has been my life. It's what I was born into. Reconciliation has been every birthday party, every Christmas dinner, every Thanksgiving gathering, where I have my Norwegian side of the family on one side and my Cree side of the family on the other side. And in the middle is their cute nephew, cute son, you know, trying to make sure everyone gets along and nobody fights. You know, that's been my life and reconciliation. You know, we just had Thanksgiving, and there's always that one, you love him to death, you love him to death. There's always that one uncle, you know what I mean, who just has those natives, you know, there's a story in the news about the natives, you know, and it just erupts, right? Just try to eat the turkey, Grandpa, you know. So I think, and you know, I don't like to paint broad strokes, but when I think about that poll, when I think about what Environics, that survey that came out, I read it, and it wasn't really surprising for me. I'm from Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan still struggles a lot with these issues. The prairies, generally, where there are high concentrations of Indigenous people, that's where Canadians seem to struggle the most with, because there's deeply ingrained stereotypes, racism, just this hatred that we haven't started to deal with yet. But there was also hope. I work a lot with young people. Canadian Roots Exchange exists to build bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people. And in that survey, 80% of young people 18 to 29 said that they believe that meaningful reconciliation can be achieved in their lifetime. That is huge. That's incredible, and that's where we have to invest in. That's where we have to focus to give young people resources and opportunities and dialogues to really learn about one another. That's what I see so lacking in Canada today. We're talking a lot about reconciliation and nation to nation, but nobody really knows what that means, and it's our governments, and you know, we have great speeches and panels, but where's that person-to-person dialogue occurring? There are pockets, there are spaces, but we can do better, and the young people of this country are thirsting for these opportunities. I see it in the demand for our programming. When I go home to Sweetgrass First Nation, I'll go berry picking with the old ladies, with the Notigiwak. And just like the Notigiwak, they can do lots of things at once. They can give me the life advice that I so desperately need, dating advice, you know, this sort of stuff. But they can also pick berries at the same time. And just like those Notigiwak, I think that Canada can talk about equality and clean water and equitable education and reforming the child welfare system. But we can also talk about UNDRIP, and we can also talk about self-determination and sovereignty and some of these harder issues. We don't have to pick. It's not either or. In fact, it must be both.
I was just thinking about the words I heard during the submission of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and it was only like yesterday. But when I heard Justice Sinclair making the presentation, I began to realize how total and complete the assimilation efforts were, and that led to the inference of cultural genocide. That's how deep the destruction was upon the Aboriginal lifeway. Spiritual ways, economic ways, family laws, everything about our society was put asunder, set aside, discredited, destroyed. And I think that as we move forward in this new time together, and we have fancy titles for decolonizing, we have to decolonize in ways that express and respond to the full spectrum of harm and loss. That's what reconciliation is. So we have to blend all of our approaches to responding to all of the needs, including those gap disparities and government structures and everything else. And it's just going to take a lot of discussion among all of us to appreciate that and truly want to find a way to move forward together that reconciles our worldview. Just because we become Canadians doesn't mean we lose our worldview. The Aboriginal worldview needs to be reintroduced. There are some powerful knowledge and powerful information, traditional science that can still make our country greater. And so we're going to keep thinking about that. Whatever it is that we're due, Aboriginals will not be the only beneficiaries. We will all be beneficiaries when we are reconciled.
So, Chief Joseph, a couple of points were raised by that last answer, which reflect some of the questions I have here. But there was another one that I might ask, because it has to do with specifically with issues of immigration and Canadian values and things like that. Under the Harper government, when new Canadians came, there's a lot of discussion of how people need to be integrated into so-called mainstream Canadian values, which are usually what we might call settler values. And so I'm just wondering, as the reconciliation process grows, will the understanding of what mainstream or Canadian values, will that change, and how might that affect how newcomers to the country understand Canadian values and integrate or don't integrate into what it means to be Canadian? I don't know if that makes sense or not, that question, but
Sure, yeah. Well, it makes lots of sense, for sure. The nice thing about being on a panel is you don't really have to answer the question. You just talk about whatever you want to. So, going back to my work, I brought together 30 young people from across Canada, from Vancouver to Halifax, even as high north as Rankin Inlet in Nunavut. And we talked. We talked about reconciliation. These were Indigenous people. These were non-Indigenous people. These were, the sons and daughters of farmers who have been here for 4 generations. These were the sons and daughters of people who got here 20 years ago. And we dialogued. When we talk about Canadian values and we talk about how new Canadians come to understand the place that they come in, we've had a hard history. In Saskatoon, there would often be some racism from folks who were new Canadians because they thought, towards Aboriginal people, because they thought that was the Canadian thing to do. Because they wanted so desperately, and I understand this, they wanted so desperately to be accepted and to fit into Canada that they would start saying, oh, don't go over there, that's where the Indians are, because that was the Canadian norm. But when I brought these 30 young people together, there was this young Filipino guy from Winnipeg who started smudging in the morning, cleansing himself in the First Nations way. That's how we wake up, greet the day, start our prayers. And he said, this is so incredible to know about you, to understand you, to see you in a way that I haven't been able to before. People try to make sure that I'm scared of you, he said to me. But when I come here, I'm not scared. I see that we have more in common than we have differences. And that's what we need to see for new Canadians. That's what we need to facilitate, these understandings that Indigenous people aren't, the thieves, the underachievers, the people who fill up the jails and who are on welfare. Indigenous people are your relatives. Indigenous people are your neighbors, your friends, and you're connected with them. And my well-being is connected to yours. I think that's what we need to see, and that's what we should facilitate as a new Canadian value.
It's hard to add to that, but I had the great pleasure about 2 years ago to speak to new Canadians when they were having their swearing-in ceremony, and it was held down at the Fort York here in Toronto. And it was a fascinating process to be part of, because what they did is they brought together Indigenous people from the area and from the territory and had them sit at tables just like you're sitting today, and sit down with the newcomers who are about to be sworn in, and to talk and share with each other, and to share your views and your opinions, and what did you learn in the newcomer guide about Indigenous people. And well, let us tell you what life is like in the city of Toronto as an Indigenous person. When the swearing-in was taking place, and that goes back to what Chief Bobby Joseph was talking, it's about those conversations. I mean, Justice Sinclair always said reconciliation is about how we talk to each other and about each other. And so that really, that environment created that opportunity for people to learn from each other. Of course, so many of the newcomers talked about how cold it was here, and that was so shocking for them. I had a few people from Jamaica that were sitting at my table, but that was the big joke. But I just wanted to share with you, we all, I think 3 of us have our TRC pins on, all different versions. And if you look at the TRC pin, it has the 7 flames that go around the circle. And those represent the 7 grandfather teachings. And when I spoke to the people that were being sworn in, the new citizens, I talked about the different teachings. And those are values that all human beings share. So I'm just going to list them for you. Love, respect, honesty, truth, courage, humility, and wisdom. I think we can all come together on those 7 grandfather teachings.
Thank you.
I think that's a really important question. I was remembering in the 1930s, the authorities swooped down in one of the villages where I come from, and they arrested a whole number of chiefs and matriarchs and other elders, and took away, confiscated a whole number of spiritual paraphernalia. And actually some of our chiefs ended up in jail for various lengths of time for being engaged in what we call the potlatch. And long after that, when I was a young man, I watched a documentary of that generation of our people talking about that experience. And one old man is a respectful term in our part of the world. One old man said, "Everybody on earth has a story to tell. Everybody on earth has a story to tell." So I think that's a really important principle, to be able to allow ourselves to tell our stories about where we come from, who we are, what our values are. Whatever we think is important about us, we should share with each other. That's how we build resilience together and harmony together. So I think that for starters, we should never try to assimilate newcomers. You should be allowed to give expression to your original worldview, your original place of origin. Otherwise, we'll have another Aboriginal problem, only being enclaves throughout our big cities. People revolting because they're stifled and can't give full expression to who they all are. And it's important for everybody in this room, every color in this room, to be able to give full expression to who you are. So we need to talk to each other. We need these dialogue circles. We need these kitchen table discussions to grow that out, this deep understanding about ourselves that transforms our relationships.
That's heavy. Yeah, it is. Thank you very much. Okay, now I'm going to ask a controversial question related to genocide, because it has been mentioned a couple of times already. So the TRC has found for cultural genocide. Justice Sinclair, now Senator Sinclair, has also talked publicly about the idea of UN-defined genocide as well, which is a crime under international law. The sort of spoiler alert is that on Friday, my understanding is there will be a press conference of Parliament, and a private member's bill will be introduced for a Indian residential schools Memorial Day, but will also ask that the government recognize the residential schools as genocide. And that bill, as far as I understand it, will be formally tabled on Monday. So my question for the panel is basically, is the genocide issue and the recognition of it. Also, the government's just recognized a Yazidi genocide and 5 other genocides in Canada, which are commemorated at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. But is the issue of genocide recognition by the government, either cultural genocide or UN-defined genocide, is that an important issue for Indigenous peoples? And is it something that might help the reconciliation process, or might it put up some perhaps roadblocks or speed bumps to that process?
I think the discussion of genocide will be a huge challenge for Canadians, but it's going to call us in that instance to our highest consciousness to think deeply about that question and to answer it for ourselves. Was that or is it genocide? And ultimately, whether we agree or not, the Canadian government may pass the law, and yet we'll still have this discussion about genocide. It still happens among our Holocaust survivors. There are still people who dispute those horrific things never happened. But what's important is that we recognize the gravity that can be when man exercises the worst of man's inhumanity to others. And I think the benefit of talking about it around that topic will challenge us to think very, very deeply about what happened here in Canada and what our responsibilities are to acknowledge it, to address it, and then to make sure it never happens again. So I hope when the moment comes, when you're asked, what do you think about it, that you're going to think about it deeply, that you're going to remember some of the words you've heard in reports and by myself and others about the deep, debilitating, destructive, despairing trauma that people have gone through, generation after generation. And we so want to be free of that. We so want to be well, to live in balance and to be respected, to live our lives with integrity. So when it comes to that moment and you talk about genocide, think about all of its implications for what happened to us as Aboriginal people, but for how we can change this time and place for all of the Canadians who will live here after us. It's a difficult question, I know. But if 7 out of 10 Canadians have already said they agreed with the characterization and that they want to reconcile, that gives us some idea about how some people are thinking about this issue. So I really, I wish I could hear your thoughts and be there when the moment comes when you're going to be counted and you say, what do you think about that? Personally, just like the former Prime Minister's apology, there were lots of Aboriginal people who weren't happy. They weren't happy with that government. They weren't happy with that Prime Minister. There was no sincerity. But the apology was important to so many of us that the highest representative of our land said, I'm sorry. And that, in some ways, vindicated a little bit all of our confusion and anger and despair and helped us to move along as individuals and as a collective. And so I think it's going to be an important question for all of you. I embrace the idea that we should talk about it, that I think it was personally. Thank you.
Just to follow up on Chief Bobby Joseph, it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It wasn't the Reconciliation Commission. And so we heard from 7,000 survivors and intergenerational survivors about their truth. And I often tell people, I remember my first day in law school in criminal law, Professor Parker, he's deceased now, he always said that the law was about proof and not about truth. And so it was just this ability to go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and not worry about, can we prove it? Is there evidence? And there was evidence. There was evidence, and we fought very hard to get those records of the evidence. But hearing those truths from survivors, and Justice Sinclair did say it was cultural genocide, but that came from the survivors that said that. At each and every national event that we held, and in private statements that they gave. And so to acknowledge those truths of those survivors, I think is so important to reconciliation. I also, reconciliation it has been said that it's not about forgiving and forgetting. It's about remembering and changing. So we have to hear those truths, as difficult as they are. We have to remember those, we have to hear them, and then we need to change, and we need to change together.
Yeah, I don't know what I can add to that. I think we have to visit this idea that maybe Canada, the idea of Canada in our head, as Canadians, We have this very romantic idea of who we are and what our country is and what we do. We're this champion of human rights. We're this defender of values that we talk about all the time. This fairness, this equality, where we think of Canada as the best place to live in the world, particularly during the U.S. election. But we have this very strong sense that we are the moral compass of the world. So Canadians struggle with this. Canadians struggle so much with the idea that genocide happened in our backyard, to our neighbors, to the people who we're uncomfortable with or who we're annoyed with, who are begging on the street over there. We don't like to think about that. We put it somewhere else. We put it away. I'm a first-generation survivor. My father attended residential school. My grandmother attended residential school. Her mother attended residential school as well. I can tell you that it was genocide. I can tell you that I never got to meet uncles and aunties because they were killed at the school, or they drank themselves to death decades later. I can tell you that my own father struggled for generations, for decades, trying to find his peace. And a large part of his life was taken away, trying to find it. He did, and I'm so proud of him for that. He is everything that I could want in a father, passing down the language, the ceremonies, the cultural teachings, the philosophies, that connection to land and community. But that's not common. That's not the story of every residential school survivor. That's not the story of every family who's been marked by this genocide. So when we talk about this, when this conversation comes up in Parliament, when you hear the pundits and the critics disparaging what happened to my family, my father, I'd ask you to reflect and to pause and to come to an understanding that maybe we aren't the best place to live in the world, that maybe we have some skeletons in our closet. But it's something, I think, being the best place in the world that we can certainly aspire to, but first we have to come to the truth.
Okay, now we've discussed a little bit about the rebuilding of Indigenous communities, governance systems, issues of self-determination. I spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and the Indigenous Maori have guaranteed seats in their parliament. 20 years ago, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples talked about having some sort of House of First Peoples or Aboriginal Parliament. So this question relates to issues of reconciliation and then Indigenous representation at provincial, local, and national levels in some institutional capacity. Should Indigenous peoples have effective political representation so that people are properly consulted over issues which affect a variety of different sorts of policy issues? It's a big question, one that has been debated and discussed for decades, but maybe we can revisit some aspects of that now.
So I lived in New Zealand for a year. The room gasps again. I'm full of tricks, and I'm a jack of all trades, really. And I saw their parliament, and I was 18. I was such a fool. It was right after high school. I was trying to be like this big, like adult, like I got to move as far away from my family as I can to prove that I'm like a man. I'm a man. So anyway, so it was a bad idea, but I learned some things. And one of those things is that having Indigenous people in your institutions, in your companies, in your boardrooms, in your places of work, changes things. It changes the way you understand your business. It changes the way you understand your policies. It changes the way that you understand your partisan politics. I was lucky enough to meet Papa Peter Sharples, who was the co-leader of the Modi Party for many years, who just retired at the last Parliament. I'd encourage you all to Google him and to read about him. His work, especially if you're a political nerd like me, it's so hard sometimes being a nerd and being 25 and Googling this instead of going out to parties. Anyways, New Zealand is leaps and bounds ahead of us because of what their Indigenous parliamentarians have been able to do and have been able to accomplish, and because there's always been a guarantee of Indigenous people, Indigenous voices, Indigenous understandings, and Indigenous philosophies in their House of Parliament. I'm very hopeful. This last election, there was a record number of Indigenous people elected into Parliament, and that was without special Indigenous seats. So take from that what you will. I don't know the answer to this. I've studied it. I've thought about it. I've reflected on it. I still don't know where I am. I know that if we go down this path, it has to be community-driven, community-led. It has to include the voices of Indigenous voters, and it'll take a lot of time and a lot of discussion. But that's something to reflect on, that we need to have more voices, Indigenous voices represented in our businesses, our boardrooms, our classrooms, and certainly our Parliament as well.
And I'll just, thanks for that, Max. Made me think of some things. I am the province of Ontario's first Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Aboriginal Justice. I didn't do that to get an applause. So for 20 years before this, I was a lawyer fighting the government of Ontario and the government of Canada. And when I was headhunted to take this job, you can imagine what my thoughts were in my head. And I really struggled and had to seek guidance from elders and friends and family. Do I want to go into this position and be the token Indian in this institution? Very difficult ministry to work in, long historical battles against Indigenous people. And, I'm in the position now for a year and a half. 80% of our staff are Indigenous. I've hired everybody from outside of government. And I see the change it's made. I see the change at the conversation at the deputy level, at the ADM level, and at the staff level. And it's, again, because of those conversations and learning about each other. They really hate me in my office sometimes because I'm constantly changing things. They like to do press, when they do press and speeches, they're always saying our Aboriginal partners. And I'm always scratching out our, and I'm always scratching out partner. And they say, why don't you like that word, Kim? Why don't you like that word partner? And I say, just because you call them your partner doesn't mean they are your partner. So think about that. So, if we are true partners, I love the word partner, but don't just say you're our partners. Be our partners and walk together. So I don't know the answer, but it made me reflect when Max shared his views. So.
I think if we lived in a perfect world, we wouldn't need any of this. There wouldn't be any special categories, this or that, or positions or representation. But because we live in a world that's deeply divided by race, racism, wrongful assumptions, hatred even, the people who have suffered the most in this country are the first people who had their own representations through their own forms of government and were completely set aside. As a matter of fact, they couldn't vote till the 1950s. And so because of that history, we eventually didn't even consider the possibility of representation or being special this or that or whatever. But I think because we're in a time of reconciliation and there's a period in which we need to close the distance and the gap between all these matters, including representation. I'm in favor that in this time, for some period, I don't know how long period it would be, that we have special representation in institutions or government. But I can tell you this as well, there's a great promise across this country. Our young people are brilliant, just like this young man to my left. Brilliant. And we have a justice minister now who's elected just on her own merit, and there are more and more Aboriginal people running for office in different places. So I think as we move forward, this will resolve itself in part, but we still have to place emphasis on encouraging young Aboriginals to be involved, to participate. So I hope that in the near future for now that we find ways to find special representation that gives voice to our concerns that will eventually close the gaps that the National Chief always talks about.